What's up guys, it's Josh from the Architecture Student blog, and as you might be able to tell, today's video is slightly different to the ones that I'd normally post. Never thought about putting myself in front of the camera because I've always thought I've got a bit of a face for radio, but I thought this video might be something a little bit different and give you a chance to see some of the work from the guy behind the Architecture Student blog. So today's video I'm going to be going through my master's degree project. I completed my degree last year. I studied at De Montfort University in Leicester in the UK for both my undergraduate and master's degree, but I'll be showing you my final year project in this video. One thing I will say before I start, just so you're aware, I did study part-time, which means that I worked in an architect's practice for 4 days a week and was given 1 day off to go to university, which means all the work that I did had to be outside of my normal 9 to 5. It has affected my workflow and the particular software that I use. So all of my work has been produced using SketchUp and Photoshop. It's the software that I feel most comfortable using. It's the one that I can be as quick and efficient with. As much as I've learned elements of Rhino and Revit, and I do think they're fantastic pieces of software. Unfortunately, in the scenario that I was in, the learning curve to get up to a level where I could produce the quantity and the level of work that I needed to for my final year project, I just had to stick to what I know, and that was just using SketchUp and Photoshop. So let's have a look at my portfolio. So this first image is my general concept image. It went top left on my presentation board, and the whole idea behind this singular page was just to try and explain all of my project and the concepts behind the project in one sheet. As you'll see on the left hand side, I've used a bit of a render just to try and make it a little bit different, get rid of as much of the white space as I could, really try and reinforce the main idea behind the project. I should probably explain what the project was. It was a cancer rehabilitation facility based in the Midlands in Birmingham, as you can probably see here. If you look at a lot of Maggie centres, for those people based in the UK, it was very similar to that, but trying to expand on the Maggie Centre philosophy and actually provide some form of cancer rehabilitation. There's a lot of personal reasons behind why I wanted to do this project, which I won't get into in this video. But yeah, that's the idea that it's a cancer rehabilitation facility, and I used a lot of evidence-based design research that I did in my written dissertation to use sort of design methodologies proven to improve particularly mental well-being. It's obviously helping people with the psychological side who are going through cancer recovery. That's just a bit of a background into the project so you actually know what you're looking at. This page was trying to explain all of that in one singular A1 drawing. As you'll see, I think it's quite good in the way, straight away where it's based, a small diagram giving you a rough idea in terms of the context of the site, which was opposite a children's hospital. And then what I think went down really well, and something perhaps to consider for future projects, is just actually explaining the concept in a diagram, just explaining the key steps behind the philosophy that I was trying to put forward. As you can see here, just trying to keeping a distinct colour scheme as well, which is sort of pinks and blues, again based on the fact that it was adjacent to the children's hospital, and they were going to be the main users of the space particularly. And just I think this sheet's got a bit of a nice balance. I think obviously looking at it now that the pink and blue can be a bit garish, perhaps I wouldn't do that again, but the balance of the sort of render on the one side and the information on the other, I think worked quite well, and this sort of the text, the way that it follows the map of the city, just sort of sits quite nicely. Again, I think the white space, could I potentially have tried to utilise a bit more colour? Maybe. Hindsight's a wonderful thing, but I think as a first drawing, it sort of set the tone for what was to come for the rest of the portfolio. So the next one is what I've called my site map, what some people might call a bit of a site plan, or however you want to describe it. I was heavily influenced by this idea of having a bit of a childish nature to the project. Like I mentioned before, the children from the hospital were going to be the main users of this space, so I wanted it to, although it's a very serious sort of hospital environment. I wanted to try and make it as playful as possible, and this image in particular was inspired by Disney and the Disney maps that you get when you go and visit the parks, if you've been fortunate enough to visit them, and this idea that you've got, you know, all of these individual spaces that are, you know, named with a bit of a sort of key over here. I found a precedent that I quite like that used this idea of like a bit of a paperclip, almost like it's a bit of a note pinned onto the drawing itself. Tried to bring some elements into the foreground just to give the drawing a bit of depth, but looking back at it now, if I'm being a bit critical, you know, I think what I've done is I've got the main sort of adjacent buildings in the detail, in the colour, extruded the shapes in SketchUp going backwards, which, you know, isn't too big of a deal. I think I probably could have done with a bit more of the detailed site context, and then as we move more further into the background of the image, it definitely needed to extrude a lot more of the buildings to give just this general idea that it's within a city. But again, you know, I think it's just, hindsight's a wonderful thing, and you can sort of look back and see what you could do. But at the time, the pressure and the stress, as everyone's probably been under before, was just, you know, it sort of got me to a point where I was happy with it, and the main focus is generally around the building itself anyway, in this kind of facility. Yeah, I kind of like the playful nature. I really don't remember, I do not remember putting this border on it, but I think that's really nice just to tie back into the colours and just bring everything back in. I think the way that I've used the warp tool on the text could have been quite a bit better. I think it looks a bit sloppy and doesn't really follow the flow. But as an overall drawing, I think if you were to look at this for the first time, you'd sort of, it works, and it does what it needs to give people an idea of how the spaces are sort of separated, and again just trying to reinforce this idea of nature. This was one of my main images. It's the image that I liked the most, and still is the image that I like the most, having gone back and looked through my portfolio for this video. The architecture is questionable, and I'll be honest, I think, you know, as a student, you just get into a zone and you push forwards with ideas. Looking back at it now, I think there's stuff that I could have definitely done a lot better. But again, this idea of layering the image, you can see the leaves at the foreground, and the idea of some birds coming through there, just sitting in front of the light rays. Again, everything that I found, these leaves at the front here were an image that I found from Google, and just applied a series of filters in Photoshop too, and again found another, but in a sort of more orangey colour, just to break up the monotony of the green. Likewise for the main central atrium, all I've used there is downloaded some PNG hanging plant files and just adjusted the colours to give the kind of the pinks, the oranges and the blues that you see there, and likewise for the bottom. Again, I think one of the key things that I learned, and I developed my own style as I mentioned at the start of the video, I really had to pick a style and stick with it. I'm happy with what I did. It was this kind of cartoonish kind of style. It's not necessarily a cartoon as such, there's that element of realism to it, but there's still very much, it's not a photorealistic image. But again, just adding that layer of depth, we've got the lady at the front who's reading a note, you've then got the children that are behind her, and then the father and son even further behind. It's just giving the drawing a little bit of depth and not making it look flat. All of the vegetation around the surroundings, all in Photoshop. I mean, I'm slightly ashamed to admit the fact that I didn't realise this until my final year, but if you go into Photoshop and go filter, render, tree, there is a library of about 35 different trees that you can pick from that'll just render straight into your image. As long as it's on a separate layer, you can move it around, you can change the direction of the light, you can change the amount of leaves. So although there's 35 types of tree, there's probably then another 100 odd different sub types of that tree that you can adjust it however you need it. That was a lifesaver for my project, because it just meant I could literally take a very bare and bland SketchUp export, bring it into Photoshop and just dot my vegetation around. I can't find my original PSD files for this, which I'm really annoyed about, because I could literally strip the drawing back and show you the sort of bare basic SketchUp render that came out. I didn't use V-Ray at all, because again, to key in with that kind of cartoon type style, I didn't actually want it to be sort of photorealistic, so there was no V-Ray whatsoever. All I did was just export textured SketchUp render, a plain black and white render with shadow, a plain black and white render without shadow, and literally just played around with the intensities of each of the layers just to give it the idea of the realism. And again, just using images that I found online with the free transform tool to move those around and scale them to suit. Now onto this image. At the time, I actually thought it was one of my best images, but looking back at it now, I think it's a really poor overall composition. I was really inspired by a lot of the Bartlett Unit 10 work and the likes of CJ Lim, and this idea of creating these kind of really outlandish perspective aerial images. You know, I don't think it's bad, it's not a bad drawing per se, but it certainly doesn't sell the project in the best light. But the idea with this image is I simply took an aerial render from SketchUp, as you can see from the back here. I then took the individual components, which were these kind of treehouse type recovery pods as such, and then just used a perspective on that in the free transform tool to almost show it sort of going back down towards the main element of the plan. And then all I did was just bring in some foreground image that is sort of an equal level right in front of you, just to give it that kind of level of depth. I don't think it's as sort of fluid in the way that it transforms towards the back of the image as it could be, but it was something completely different, and I don't think many people tried to go with this style of image in the final crit, so it definitely did stand out and was something that people sort of pointed out to me. But looking back at it now, it's certainly not one of the drawings that I think it is one of my best. But we live and learn, you know. I think, you know, this sun in the background is just shocking, really. The clouds in front did work, I'll admit. Again, this idea of trying to layer your images and bring things to the foreground and push things to the background, including some clouds just using a cloud brush tool that you can find online relatively easily. The link's in one of my other videos, just to dot some clouds in front of it. I think it gave it an extra level of depth, and again, just bring in this kind of vegetation. The blossom flowers I downloaded off Google, again likewise with the robin, and then everything else vegetation wise is just straight from that Photoshop render tool that I showed you. Onto the next image. Again, another image that I'm happy with. I think the overall composition works well. This one, obviously, I've included a bit of a scroll at the bottom to give it a bit of a description, which I think works. But again, layering the vegetation, just bringing some in. I'll be honest, I know for a fact that one there was just to fill a bit of a gap that was there, but I think it does actually bring a bit extra to the drawing. The light rays coming through, I think, was a massive game changer for me, because it really gave this idea of the light sort of forcing itself through the openings within this grid shell roof that I've designed. That was quite simply just getting the paintbrush tool, using a soft brush, drawing lines down where I wanted the light to be shown, and then just using the motion blur tool to quite simply change the direction of the blur in sort of that kind of direction. Admittedly, that's known as blurring the whole image, but then all that does is it quite simply just creates this kind of, it's not quite as intense as if you were to do it with a brush, so it just disperses the light, and I think it gives it a really realistic impression of the light coming through, which was a great help, really, and really brought the drawing to life. Leaves, again, I mean, And I think this is the thing that I learned in terms of my workflow. It might have taken me a while to start off with to get these leaves looking right, but they feature in every single one of my renders. So it might have taken me, I don't know, half an hour to sort out some leaves and get them to be how I want them to be. But then actually to be able to copy those over into every single one of my renders, just adjusting the, you know, the position and the size of them to make them not completely the same. It really helped in terms of speeding the drawings up, but making them just have that extra level of detail. Likewise, just using the dune grass tool and a couple of different colours and shades of green, just to show the sedum roof that was going over the top. It just gives you that extra little bit of detail that perhaps otherwise might make the drawing look a bit flat. And I think that's what I learned through going through this process, is actually when I'm doing my renders, you do really need to think of them almost as if you're taking a photograph. You know, you want something interesting in the background and your focal point, but you might start bringing things into the foreground just to add that extra little bit of intrigue and make it different to the normal kind of things that you'd see. Likewise with this third render, my least favourite of all of them, I've got to be honest. I quite like the little design that I did for these kind of hanging plant pots, again using the dune grass tool just to give this idea of almost like a bit of a fur and a turf covering the pots themselves. Same again really, it's going to sound like I'm repeating myself, but all of the plants that I've used were just taken straight from Google, and then just selecting the colours and adjusting the colours just to make it pop a little bit rather than them sort of blending in with the background. And again, light rays coming through slightly different this time. I think I went with more of a radial blur to try and give it this idea of it really flooding through the space, and just using this figure just to help break up the overall image. All of the figures that you've seen so far, I should say, I have done them myself. I've gone to the standard Entourage websites that you would, whatever that might be. There are so many out there, I can't even think of the names of them. And literally all I would do is use the magnetic lasso tool and just add a colour over the top, and quite simply just keep building them up, keep drawing around them. And then what I would do is once I'd done that, I'd take the original Entourage drawing, duplicate it, bring it in front of all of that colour, and then apply a filter to it, so it almost just turns it into a bit of a black and white image. And then I could just drop the opacity of it, but then that just gives you these extra kind of shadow details. So they're not quite fully photorealistic, but they're a little bit more complex than your standard kind of coloured figures that you see. My own style, everyone's entitled to their own opinion on it. I just thought it added a little bit of extra depth to the figures and made them look slightly more realistic without it being too much of a photorealistic imitation, which obviously if it's not done right, and it wouldn't really suit the kind of image that I'm going for. And then the final image that I'll go over in this video, the outside. Again, I think, you know, I've got to accept the limitations of SketchUp here, and I think some of the detail coming through looks a bit basic. I think the level of detail that you get with the building itself works well. I think I could have done with dropping the opacity on the context, trying to bring the building itself more into focus. But again, textures from Google, bringing them into Photoshop just to show the road going on. All of the street furniture was done in SketchUp because it just made my life a lot easier. Just adding the figures in walking along the street to give that extra bit of detail. So yeah, that's my portfolio. If you want to see more of my work, I have got some of the technical drawings that I've done. I've got more of the actual portfolio itself. These were just some of the final images that I produce. If you like this kind of video and want to see a bit more, let me know in the comments below, and I'll be more than happy to do another video with some more of my images. If you'd like to see some tutorials on how I produce these kind of images, again, let me know. It's something that I can show the processes that I went through to make these kind of images just from SketchUp and Photoshop. And yeah, as always, if you like the video, please give it a like. If you don't subscribe already, subscribe and we'll just keep producing videos.